In the first round of the presidential games, we have McKinley versus Carter. Carter, with his Camp David Accords, is a very strong candidate to win this, but McKinley counters it with the open door policy, which um, expanded trade with the U.S. and Europe. But I'm gonna have to give it to McKinley. McKinley. I'm gonna have to give it to McKinley because Carter had a very bad showing at the Iran hostage crisis. He had a very bad reaction, and that's why we have McKinley winning over Carter.
The first round of the presidential games in the East started with a severe blowout. Although Clinton did put up a fight with the Iraqi Limitation Act, FDR overpowered him with his Neutrality Act that prevented the U.S. from entering future wars. And due to the cruise missile crisis, decisive victory to FDR first round. The second round of the presidential games was a much more closely contested match between the Obama administration and the Nixon foreign administration. The Obama administration took an early lead with the removal of all nuclear weapons from Iran, but the Nixon foreign administration made an astounding comeback in the second half with pinging upon diplomacy of China, which opened trade between the Chinese Americans and many other countries. And then Obama's downfall was when he prematurely removed troops from Iraq, causing future turmoil for the countries and Middle Eastern countries surrounding it. But therefore, we'll have to give this victory to Nixon.
In the second round of the presidential games of the West, we have TR versus Harding, Hoover, and Coolidge. Harding, Hoover, and Coolidge were good presidents in that Harding had the Washington Naval Conference, which regulated naval powers and would open the door with China for trade. Hoover would do immigration restriction, and Coolidge would do the Kellogg-Grant Pact, which would have 16 countries sign and would Kellogg-Grant Pact, which would which would have 16 countries renounce war. TR would counter all 3 points with his point of the Panama Canal, which linked the two oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific. Then Hoover, Harding, and Coolidge also did bad things in the Ford-McDundy Act, which was done by Harding, and it raised tariffs. Then Hoover was the president during the Red Scare, and Coolidge would be the president to sign the Stimson Doctrine, which would allow Russia to annex the Baltic countries. This is why I'm gonna have to give the victory to TR.
Round 1, Game 3 was thrill-seeking the whole way. We had Wilson and Bush Jr. battling the whole time. Wilson came prepared with his 14 points for promoting peace in all nations after World War I, and Bush Jr. started an attack on terror after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But Bush's administration's downfall was when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and therefore we have to give the victory to Wilson.
In the third game of the first round of the playoffs, in the presidential games, we have Truman versus Bush Sr. Bush Sr. went out to an early lead with the attacks in Panama to overthrow the dictator, but would ultimately be countered by Truman, ending World War II. Moreover, Bush Sr. would have a negative point in his attack on Somalia, where 2 blackbirds got shot down and 18 people died. Therefore, Truman will be the winner, of this round.
In the final game of the first round, Eisenhower administration came out strong and started what seemed to be a blowout, with Eisenhower's ending of the Korean War. But then the Reagan administration came back as they defeated the Germans and had Gorbachev tear down the Berlin Wall. But the downfall of the Reagan administration was the Reagan Doctrine, which was goal was to fight against communism and contain it, but was ultimately a failure, supporting billions of dollars to a failed plan. And therefore, the victory for this final game of the first round goes to Eisenhower.
In the final game of the first round of the presidential games in the West, we have Kennedy versus Johnson. Kennedy takes an early lead with the Bay of Pigs, but would be countered by Johnson's response to the Tonkin Gulf, the Gulf of Tonkin, where Vietnam tried to put missiles into the Gulf of Tonkin and got bombed by Johnson's administration. This proved not to be enough because Johnson had some struggles during his time. One being he put too many troops in Vietnam, and two, he allowed Fidel Castro to become the communist leader of Cuba. For that reason, I have Kennedy moving on to the next round.
Of the presidential games, we had Roosevelt and Nixon Ford facing off. Roosevelt brought to the table the good neighbor policy, which emphasized trade between North and South American countries. And then Nixon Ford administration brought Vietnamization, which was the training of Vietnamese troops to fight their own battles and slowly pulling out American troops. But then the downfall of the Nixon Ford administration was Ford publicly declaring that Poland was only 3 elections and they're still controlled by another country. And therefore, for these reasons, the winner of the first round, of the second game of the first round, is Roosevelt.
In the first game of the second round of the presidential games, we have McKinley versus Roosevelt. Roosevelt came in with the point of the Great White Fleet. This allowed America's fleet to increase. This also would then be sailed around the world, showing that America is the best. This point would be countered by McKinley in that he won the Spanish-American War. His administration won the Spanish-American War, which made Europe have less influence in the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, Roosevelt's administration would be negatively impacted by the Roosevelt corollary, in that South America would have less faith in the United States, and also it also broke the Good Neighbor Act. For this reason, I have McKinley moving on to the next round.
Okay. In the last game of the second round of the presidential games, we have Wilson and Eisenhower. Wilson came with the Arabic pledge, which said no more German subs can attack U.S. Navy ships or merchant ships on the high seas. And then Eisenhower came with how he handled the Suez Canal crisis between Israel and Egypt, and bartered out a deal that had Egypt recognize Israel as a country and being the first Arabic country to recognize it, which made it a big deal. But in the end, Wilson came up short as he attempted to set up the United Nations, but was a failure, and tried to break the isolationist code, which U.S. had established for years before, and that was established by our founding fathers, and therefore we have Eisenhower advancing and winning the second round. That was brutal.
Second game of the second round of the playoffs in the presidential games, we have Truman versus Kennedy, where Kennedy comes out to an early lead through his talks at Vienna and Berlin. This point would be countered by Truman through the Truman Doctrine, which slowed the spread of communism. Moreover, the Kennedy administration would be negatively impacted by the Cuban Missile Crisis in that the Russians put missiles into Cuba but had to take them out. But the trade-off was that the missiles in Europe had to be pulled out by the United States, which were there before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it put strain on the U.S. and also lost them the missiles in Europe. For this reason, I have Truman moving on to the next round.
In the first matchup of the Final Four games, presidential games, we have President Roosevelt and Eisenhower facing off. President Roosevelt brought to the table the Tehran Conference, which grouped three world superpowers together, being Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States, with an alliance against the Nazi Germany forces in Europe. And Eisenhower brought to the table his talks of diplomacy with China, which stopped China from spreading its communist influences to Taiwan. But Eisenhower's administration's good was undermined by the U-2 bombing incident, which had American U-2 planes that were flying above Russia shot down and causing more political tension between the two countries. And therefore, for this round, we have President Roosevelt advancing to the final round.
In the Final Four game of the West of the presidential games, we have McKinley versus Truman. McKinley came out guns blazing with his point of the Platt and Teller Amendment, which respectively said to the Cubans that that America would not annex them, and after the war was over, they would pull their troops out of Cuba. This point is countered by Truman in that he and his administration recognized Israel first. This point's better. This point is greater than McKinley's in that it created a new country and another person for the United States to trade with. Moreover, McKinley's administration was negatively impacted by the Boxer War, which was a war in the Philippines. It was poorly run and was not a good war for the United States to be in. For this reason, I have Truman moving on to the finals. In the championship match of the presidential games, we have Truman versus Roosevelt.
Roosevelt came in and he provided economic and military aid to foreign nations during World War II.
Whereas Truman counters this point by, after World War II, giving financial aid to Japan to get back on their feet.
But Truman's downfall was him starting the Korean War. And for those reasons, this year's champion is Roosevelt.
You can